What are we supposed to make of it? How are we supposed to make sense out of what this plot entails? And it requires, I think, a bit more unpacking from the standpoint of what it takes to really understand what Mozart is trying to do here. And it requires a lot too on the side of the production and what the director chooses to do, how the cast members choose to portray their parts. So I hope that across these two talks, I'll be able to sort of equip you with a skill set and an understanding of this work that you'll be able to get a lot more out of it than you might otherwise. Because again, I think this one does really require a lot of time, thought, and effort put into what it is that we're to make of this operatic masterpiece. So it's good timing too, since we're 3 weeks or so out from when this actually happens. You'll have plenty of time to come to terms with this work. Here's the game plan for tonight. We'll look at this work through an historical lens, understand something of how the work comes into existence, what Mozart and his collaborator Da Ponte were trying to accomplish with this work. We'll take a look at the work from the reception history angle, that is what critics and observers at the time made of it. And then we'll try to follow what clues we can, both from the text that Da Ponte wrote and from Mozart's music itself, in terms of how we can best try to understand what this opera is doing. So that's the game plan for tonight. Again, this is one of a pair of 2 lectures. And so when we come back a week from tonight, we'll have sort of a listening lab of sorts. I'm interested to look at performing traditions with this opera, and we'll do some comparative listening of 3 different sample recordings across about 75 or 80 years worth of operatic recorded history to get a sense of how artists have approached this work across time. And we'll do some analytical listening as well, trying to break apart exactly what it is Mozart has accomplished with this score. So that's our game plan. Let's dive right in. Lorenzo da Ponte wrote a memoirs of his life in which he has lots to say about everything in most cases. But when it comes to Così fan tutte, Da Ponte is surprisingly parsimonious with his description of this work. He does not have near as much to say about where it came from, what they were trying to do. It almost goes by with just a passing mention. In brief, Da Ponte describes it this way. It's the quote at the top of the slide. He ranks this work as 3rd place among the 3 sisters born of that most celebrated father of harmony. You get a sense that this was a work of troubled genesis. Da Ponte surely would have had much more to say if he was really enthused about how everything played out. There's a lot of circumstances surrounding this work that we get the sense might have left a bitter taste in the mouth of Da Ponte. And so he sort of dismisses it relatively efficiently in his memoirs. But he is, I think, keen to point out that it is really part of a cohesive set of operas that he creates in collaboration with Mozart. So these 3 works being The Marriage of Figaro from 1786, Don Giovanni from 1787, and then the latest one written just a year before Mozart's death, Così fan tutte, premiered in early 1790. So certainly Da Ponte and Mozart see these works as all part of the same project. And despite the very different plots that we find in these 3 operas, it's clear that they in fact work pretty cohesively as an actual trilogy. Not a trilogy in the sense of recurrent characters, but a trilogy in the sense that every one of these operas seems interested to be exploring the same thematic ideas in their plot materials. We find in all 3 of these operas that Mozart and Da Ponte are interested in interrogating, on the one hand, the potential for fidelity. That is, can people actually be true to each other? Maybe they can't. Perhaps they can. And then related to that, what happens when they aren't true to each other? That is, what are the ramifications of infidelity? So is it possible to maintain fidelity? And if one doesn't, what are the ramifications of that? Thus, in The Marriage of Figaro, there are all kinds of issues of jealousy and whether one can trust one's spouse, what happens when a spouse loses interest in the relationship, etc. That's what Marriage of Figaro is all about, as you saw last season. Don Giovanni seems to take it to one far extreme. What if we explore a title character who is nothing but a master of infidelity? What happens to him? Well, he gets dragged to hell at the end of the opera. Così fan tutte, on the other hand, takes sort of less of a mythical stature and instead tries to put it in the household of just normal, average, ordinary people. People who are not yet married. People who were trying to figure out, can they in fact trust their hoped to be future spouses to be true to them over time? So again, it is really a tightly conceived collection of operas here. This speaks well, I think, for Così fan tutte. It is clearly a part of this project. It is interesting that Da Ponte thinks of it as the least of the three, however, because in fact, this, on some levels, appears to be a work that might have been the best of the three. Certainly, Mozart put great stock into what he was doing. And in conceiving of this work, it's worthwhile to start with looking at the original cast that these collaborators were working with. For with only one exception, all of the lead roles, and again, there are only 6 roles in this opera plus the chorus, all of the roles in this opera, with one exception, were singers that had a lengthy experience of having collaborated with Mozart. Mozart knew their voices intimately well. This is a very sort of unusual experience for Mozart. Oftentimes he was working with singers who he had never written before. It was part of the writing process that he would spend time with the cast members, sort of rehearsing their voice, discovering what the potentials of their voice presented to him, and then tailoring the material he wrote for them in very particular and specific ways. So that would have been the normal process. And Mozart would often have had to spend, a couple of weeks figuring out what a voice could do before he'd be ready to write an aria for that voice. But with Così fan tutte, again, with just that one exception, all of these characters were people that Mozart had worked with before. So for instance, the Fiordiligi, Adriana Ferrarese del Bene, was just recently on stage as Susanna in a revival of the Marriage of Figaro. And it's in fact the success of that revival of the Marriage of Figaro that seems to have led directly to the opportunity for Mozart to be commissioned to write Così fan tutte. So he knew that voice because she's Susanna. And I should point out in passing, or perhaps not so much in passing, but Miss Adriana here was Lorenzo da Ponte's mistress. So that surely had something to do with why she was cast as the lead female soprano in this opera as well. You might also be curious to know that Mozart had a very low opinion of her voice. So he did not like her acting or how she sang, but he made it work. New to the Viennese scene was Louise Villeneuve. Mozart had not created a role for her before, but he had written other arias that she sang in other composers' operas. So she was sort of just making her way in Vienna, and this was the first time that Mozart created a role for her, but he certainly knew what her voice could do before this. You'll notice that the Guglielmo Francesco Benucci was the creator of the Figaro role. Lastly, then, a married couple, Francesco and Dorotea Busani, who previously had created roles in Marriage of Figaro. That would be Bartolo and Antonio and Cherubino, respectively. And Busani, Mr. Busani, had been around longer than that. He'd also created roles in Don Giovanni as well. So Mozart was all over what these voices were capable of. Thus, it is no surprise that we find in this score an intensity and frequency of ensemble singing that goes beyond even what we had already heard in Don Giovanni or in Marriage of Figaro, operas that both have lots more ensembles than would be normal at the time. Here, Mozart even doubles down yet again. There is an incredible proliferation of ensemble singing in this opera, and it seems to be that Mozart understood how well these people work together as a team, and so he knew that he could get away with doing that. My brackets here try to show the pairing that we start with and the pairing that is played around with in the middle of this opera. Let's give just the teeniest nutshell of plot because it'll make some other things make sense later in this talk. At the start, we have 2 gentlemen who are both happily in love with their fiancés and looking forward to getting married. The pairs at the beginning of the opera are Fiordiligi, paired with Guglielmo, and Dorabella, paired with Ferrando. And again, they're very happy with each other, looking forward to their life ahead. These gentlemen, however, are friends with one Don Alfonso, and he proposes to them a friendly wager. He says, I know what you should do. You should pretend like you're going off to war, come back in disguise, and try to woo the other woman's fiancé and see if they will be true to you or not. Our two gentlemen are, of course, wholly convinced that these women are nothing but paragons of virtue and will surely be true to their gentleman, whereas Don Alfonso is very confident that he's going to win the wager. So they pretend to go off to war. They come back in disguise. In the opera, they come back in disguise as Albanians, which is just essentially shorthand for some exotic place where they dress funny. The reason that they seem to have picked Albanians is because right around this time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is at war with Turkey. And so there was lots of sort of Turkish exoticism going around Vienna at the time. People were really excited about how they dress in Turkey and how funny they look and how they eat different things and all this stuff. And so rather than cast them as Turks, because that hits a little too close to home, given that an actual war is actually happening, so they just sort of sidestep it to a neighboring country of Albania. So that's why they come back as Albanians. They woo the other women, and of course, in the end, to make a long story short, Don Alfonso is proved correct. The women do both fall for the alternate suitor in a very short amount of time and are ready to get married by the end of this opera. So there's our test of fidelity and our exploration of the ramifications of infidelity, the themes that are consistent across these three operas. Now, many accounts will present Cosi fan tutte as if it were a failure in its initial performance. I've already laid out the background to show that, in fact, Mozart certainly took this project very seriously. Despite Da Ponte's quick dismissal of the work in his memoir, he sees it as part of this trilogy. We talked about how the cast was so well known to Mozart, how he is crafting music on such a high level of sophistication. Clearly, these gentlemen took their work very seriously. So where does this myth of the work's failure come? Well, the opera itself had a troubled history getting to the stage. When Lorenzo da Ponte initially authored the libretto of this opera, it had a totally different title. It was originally called The School of Lovers, which in some ways makes more sense than this rather difficult to translate Italian phrase Cosi fan tutte. So the school for lovers, and in this case, Don Alfonso is the teacher, and the lovers totally get schooled, to use a more contemporary idiom. This libretto was originally intended for Antonio Salieri, famous as the villain rival in the movie Amadeus, but of course, really, yes, they're rivals, but they were also colleagues. Mozart and Salieri had a great respect for each other. There's no villainy there. What we know from Salieri's biography, at this phase in his career, in the late 1780s, Salieri was essentially suffering from writer's block. Da Ponte writes this libretto for Salieri. Salieri tries his hand at it and essentially can't crack the nut, so to speak. Salieri, in a number of other compositions, is struggling with what he should do, how he should go forward. It is a very fallow period in Salieri's output. He simply doesn't write that much. Mostly what he does bring to performance are older works that he is revising. So he's sort of, tinkering around the edges rather than creating new original work. So after sketching just a few numbers, Salieri halts his efforts. And now, Da Ponte's got in his hands a perfectly good libretto without a composer. Enter Mozart. We know from the surviving primary source materials that Mozart's work is well underway by fall of 1789. We know that Mozart, as I've said, is taking his work very seriously on this project, and one measure of that is the fact that of all the musical figures that Mozart respected, there was none more respected than Haydn. And who should Mozart want to come and attend rehearsals with him but none other than Haydn? Obviously, if Mozart didn't think this project was top shelf work, he wouldn't have bothered to bring Haydn along to the theater for rehearsals. And twice, Haydn accompanies Mozart. Once to hear an initial rehearsal when Mozart is rehearsing the singers from the piano, and then one orchestral rehearsal right before the premiere. So obviously, this is top quality work. Mozart is excited to show his peers what he is up to. Finally, then we get to the premiere itself, the 26th of January, 1790. Here's where the myth starts to seem real. The work only performed 5 times after its premiere in January 1790. One would think, looking at just the data, clearly this is a failed work because it received so few performances. It's very unusual for a new opera by Mozart to be performed so few times. But there's, of course, a reason to this, and the people who see it as a failed work have not bothered to pay attention to the history of what's actually going on there. If we look at the theatrical receipts, we find that of all the operas produced by the opera company in Vienna during that season, Mozart's Così fan tutte has 1, the largest attendance of any other opera, and 2, sells the most tickets per performance and thus the biggest house receipts. So it's the most lucrative work of the season. Cut short because Emperor Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the one bankrolling this opera company, the one who saw to it that Mozart received the commission to write it, the one who was Lorenzo da Ponte's patron, the one who gave da Ponte the job of being court poet, thus the one tasked with writing librettos for the opera house. Well, Joseph II falls very ill. And on the day that he is given his last rites, they shut down all the theaters in Vienna. So, of course, Mozart's opera could not rack up more performances. All the theaters have been closed. And some weeks later, Joseph II finally does pass away, which then leads to a period of obligatory mourning. The emperorship passes to Joseph II's brother, Leopold II. Lucky for Mozart, Leopold II did like Mozart, but unlucky for da Ponte, Leopold II did not like him. Now, we need to remember that Lorenzo da Ponte was originally trained and educated as a priest. He did serve for some time before he decided that he was too into women to be able to maintain a career being a priest. He runs around Europe, has many, many affairs. He runs around Europe, befriends, does all kinds of debauched things that we see some bits of autobiography in Don Giovanni's character, for instance. So da Ponte is sort of an unscrupulous character. And the new emperor, Leopold II, was much more conservative in his personal tastes, shall we say. He had a higher value on propriety of good living than his brother, Joseph II, did. And so he promptly dismisses da Ponte from employment. This essentially dooms the future fate of Così fan tutte. The theater doesn't want to spend too much time and effort with this kind of work. Also, Leopold II's taste is not for these really complicated opera buffas like Mozart and da Ponte were writing. He likes either serious opera or he likes comic operas that are really simple and straightforward. So all of this means Così fan tutte is not the work for him. In fact, when Così fan tutte does finally make it back to the stage, late in the summer of 1790, it gets just 5 additional performances. So it's at the tail end of the season. Most Viennese, the ones who, populate the opera house and buy the tickets to go there, these upper class Viennese are all out to their countryside homes because it's starting to get hot in the big city. So there's nobody around town to come see these works, and its fortunes change after that. One other thing I'd like to mention in passing about Emperor Leopold II, it is for his coronation that Mozart writes the Clemency of Titus, La Clemenza di Tito. So Mozart is very well connected, clearly stays in the good graces of the upper aristocracy, but it is just Così fan tutte and its connection with da Ponte is, out of favor. So there's sort of our history of how this opera comes to the stage and how this opera first lands. Now, what do audiences make of it when it first comes to the stage? Again, they clearly wanted to be there, bought lots of tickets, earned the theater lots of money. But did they like it or not? Well, this is where we get to sort of the issues with needing to unpack the surrounding context for Così fan tutte. And I want to look at just some quick snippets of the reception that this work was met with when it was new. Because despite the fact that the audience seems to popularly enjoy this work, there is always an undercurrent that perhaps there's something off about it. One stance, and the stance that we find echoed throughout most of the 19th century, is that what Mozart did is amazing, and any problem you might have with this work is Da Ponte's fault. Now, again, the work on the project shows that Mozart was totally on board with what he was doing here. And so a comment like this one, a critic writing for the Annal of the Theater, a Berlin newspaper, describing it as a wretched Southern European product with all the powerful, sublime music of Mozart. Some translators won't say Southern European, what will be explicit about it, a wretched Italian product. So clearly we're blaming Da Ponte here and not Mozart for any problems that we might have with this opera. Now, the plot, with its swapping of which lovers get paired together, there's no way around it. It makes the women characters look terrible. It makes the men characters look terrible too, because they're up for this trick. But the women are shown to be weak-willed and unable to stay true and happy to change their affiliations and happy to run off and marry somebody that they just met a few days ago. And so the women don't come out looking great at sort of a surface level read. And initial viewers were somewhat troubled by that too. For instance, from Friedrich Schroeder, a famous opera director and theatrical producer at the time, he described Così fan tutte as being a miserable thing debasing all women. It cannot be a success, for no woman in the audience will like it. So you can, reserve your own opinion for when you go see it in a few weeks. We get an interesting glimpse into how this might have been perceived in the Mozart household. It seems like Mozart's widow, Constanza, was herself somewhat ill at ease with the story that this opera presents. So Vincent Novello, this is of the English Novello Publishing House. You maybe have looked at like choral scores published by Novello. Been around a long, long time. And one of the things that Vincent Novello was interested in doing was maintaining a relationship with continental composers to acquire scores to publish in England. And he befriended Constanze Mozart and regularly corresponded with her, visited her in Vienna, and published accounts of the conversations that he had with her. And in one of these accounts, we read this, Vincent Novello recounting what Mozart's widow Constanze thought. She does not much admire the plot of Così, but agreed with me that such music would carry any piece. So again, we see this separation that maybe the story is messed up, but the music is great. And to further that idea that Mozart wrote great music, but it was an opera he should have never bothered with in the first place, we find springing up sometime in the 1830s, an apocryphal account, an untrue account, yet one that is widely repeated throughout the 19th and early 20th century literature on Mozart's operas, that in fact, Mozart didn't want to even write this opera, only did it because the emperor had demanded it happen. This is not true in any way, shape, or form, but it is oft repeated, and we find it starting sometime in the mid-1830s. Again, Mozart clearly understood what he was doing. He took on this project quite consciously, and we will see the level of sophistication that he put into this project. He surely bought into what this story was trying to do, otherwise he would not have wasted his time. We see too, from his enthusiasm to share it with Haydn, that Mozart is on board with this. And we find that his music, of course, gives us the clue to understanding what is going on here. So now I want to turn to the work itself to see if we can get some clues from the material that Da Ponte wrote, from the material that Mozart composed, that might help us understand what it is that they are trying to accomplish. So as we try to grapple with these challenges, we should take into account a number of things that make this work very different than the other collaborations between Mozart and Da Ponte. In the case of La Nozze di Figaro, Da Ponte is adapting a play that already exists, that written by Beaumarchais. In the case of Don Giovanni, Da Ponte is adapting an opera libretto that already exists. So he's got material that has already proven its effectiveness on the stage. In the case of Così fan tutte, on the other hand, it is assembled from a wide array of source material. We can go back to ancient Greek and Roman mythology, where we find myths about lovers who were tested whether they were true or not through disguise. From Commedia dell'arte in Italian opera, in Italian theatrical troupes, we find all kinds of plays based on deriving their comedy from mistaken identity, based on putting on a disguise to fool somebody. So there's one of the ingredients. There are also factual ingredients, things that are happening in the real world around the same time that Mozart and Da Ponte seem to have been into. For instance, let me give you just two examples of things that were widely written about in the local Viennese press at the time. The press talked about, one, a ship of English convicts being deported to the penal colony of Australia. And the press followed this with great interest because it became known that one of these female convicts fell in love with and was impregnated by one of the sailors on the boat that was delivering her to Australia. He was supposed to go back to England, earn his wage, get himself back to Australia, and then marry this woman who was going to have his baby. Well, the press was very thrilled to report that she was in Australia for no more than just a few days before she up and married somebody else, because she had apparently given up on the fact that he was going to sail back and reunite with her. And the fact that she would change that quickly in the span of just a few days from being ready to marry one guy to getting hitched to another guy gives us the kernel of precisely what happens in Così fan tutte. There was another story in the Viennese press around the same time about a pair of nobleman brothers who essentially did in the real world the thing that this plot is all about. They came in disguise and tried to woo other women after they were promised to somebody else. So this is very topical plot material. It is related to stuff that Mozart's Viennese audience would have seen on the stage, would have been reading about in the newspapers. And so the oddity that we as modern listeners and modern viewers might find in this work was probably not so odd at all to Mozart's audience of the time. And so it's really important for us to try to approach this work with a perception that takes into account what these 18th century people would have been thinking about and how they would have understood what they were seeing enacted on stage. This leaves us, of course, though, with a work that, because of this distance, because of the broad array of reference points, means that a stage director today has a lot of decisions to make. How do they want to affect these disguises? How true do they want to play the emotions? How do they want to resolve it at the end? Mozart and Da Ponte seem pretty happy to just have the couples revert to their normal form and everybody moves on older and wiser. It is an obvious question for a modern director today to ask, is that even possible to move on the same way? Or perhaps our pairs of lovers have found out that they actually like the other one better and should stay recoupled. You know, all of these things are possible decisions, or maybe they've decided that these relationships, regardless of which one, hold no future and they're going to all go for their separate ways. Operas that require us to make so many choices are harder pills to swallow. And so it'll be interesting to see how your director chooses to play these things. I do not know. I'm not privy to those discussions, so it'll be something for you to pay attention to. If the text itself offers confusion, then of course we have to turn to Mozart's music to guide our comprehension of the meaning and the message. So let's see what Da Ponte has to say first, though. If we look at his text, it is striking at how many times Da Ponte puts words in the mouths of his characters that are seemingly directed more at us, the audience, so that we can understand what to take away from this admittedly confusing story than they are words directed at informing some of the other characters about what's going on. And so let me identify two particular phrases that I think are very telling in this way. There are many of them. And so you, as viewers of this opera, should be on the lookout. When does the text seem to be telling us a clue about how to make, rather than just being conversation among the characters? So here's two that I find useful. In Act 2, Scene 8, as the two gentlemen are consoling themselves about the fact that their women are proving not to be true to them after all, Guglielmo says this: "It's always a good thing to be a little suspicious in this world." And I think this gives us an important clue for how to approach the material we are seeing. We should be suspicious about it too. I think we should be suspicious about the motivations of the character. I think we should be suspicious about whether the characters themselves are telling us something that we can take honestly, or if the characters are telling us something that they in fact don't themselves mean. You know, it's really easy in opera because we are so conditioned by our familiarity with the 19th century repertory, which by and large is very straight ahead. If a composer if a character on stage sings that they are in love, we should probably take them at their word. If a character on stage says that they are terrified, we should probably take them at their word. If a character on stage says that they are feeling brave and heroic or feeling anxious and frightened, it's all very straightforward. That kind of sort of directness is a part of the 19th century aesthetic. That is not what we find in Cosi fan tutte. This is one of the reasons why those false stories about it being a failure, about it being all de Ponte's fault, about how Mozart didn't even want to write this opera, all of those come in because it doesn't fit with the 19th century mold for what opera should be. It is always a good thing to be a little suspicious in this world, says Guglielmo. A second key to unlocking this opera happens very quick in passing in the Act 1 finale. The setup for this phrase essentially is this. Our two gentlemen have come back in disguise. They have pretended to take poison. They have pretended that they are about to die because they have taken poison because the two women aren't yielding to their affections. And when the women have recovered them through the efforts of a doctor who performs a magnetic mesmerism routine on them, they get really mad that these gentlemen would do such a stupid thing as to try to take their own lives after having just met these women for a few hours. And the gentlemen are, of course, happy that their ladies are so angry because it suggests that maybe they really will stay true to them. But even then, they seem suspicious. Ferrando and Guglielmo in Singing and Duets say this: "I don't know if it's feigned or genuine, this rage and fury." They're not sure if the women are really that upset about the fact that these two suitors in disguise have done this incredibly ridiculous, overly demonstrative thing in trying to convince them to fall in love with them. These two words, feigned or genuine, this, I think, is the most important key for us to understand what's going on in this opera. In Italian, it's finta o vera, feigned or genuine. And so we can do some sort of like free word association here. These words, I think, are a framework for how we should try to parse out what we see the characters on stage doing. When a character does something, says something, expresses feelings in a certain way, we should ask ourselves, is this in fact a feigned expression of emotion? Meaning, is it affected? Is it contrived? Is it deceptive? Is it disingenuous, farcical, insincere, parodistic, or performative? They may say they're really sad. They may say they're really angry. But maybe they're just pretending to be sad or angry because they know that is how they are supposed to act. Sometimes, of course, we do find genuine expressions of emotion. We will certainly find moments in which it seems like the characters are being entirely authentic, earnest in how they are behaving, frank and honest in what they are saying. There are times when the admissions the characters make seems entirely self-aware, sincere, transparent, or truthful. Where I find the genius of Mozart and Da Ponte to reside in this opera is the way in which these two creative masters are able to position these contrasting sides of the coin side by side, sometimes turning in an instant from what seems like it is farce, but can immediately become a great depth of emotion. Mozart's music, of course, has a great deal to do with this. The music is generally entirely earnest and self-aware and sincere in its expression, even in a setup that is completely farcical. And so this coexistence of these different things means that this opera requires of us as viewers a very different sort of mindset for how to make sense of what we are seeing. So here I think are some keys to understanding the opera's theatricality. Given this contrast between finta and vera, the truth is this opera requires you, the listening audience, to be able to tolerate a whole lot of contradiction and ambiguity. It is not a straight-ahead story. There may be mysteries in the marriage of Figaro, but they are unraveled. Don Giovanni, it is clear from the beginning where he is headed. He does, after all, murder somebody on stage in the very first scene. Like, we know where that's going to end. This one, lots contradicts itself. Lots is ambiguous. This is, of course, one of the challenges for the director of the opera, is how to present on stage, how to make clear for an audience what stance we might take on those contradictions and ambiguities. Mozart's music is our guide through this perilous pathway of understanding. And this quotation comes from the writer of this book right here. This is one of the Cambridge Opera Handbooks, a series of book-length studies on major masterpieces of the operatic literature. There are many dozens of them covering most of the major operas of the repertory, and Bruce Allen Brown was the author tapped to write the one on Cosi fan tutte, where he explains how very real emotions are being stimulated through artificial means. So much of what happens in this plot is ridiculous, patently so, and intentionally so. Mozart and Da Ponte are masters of stagecraft. They certainly know if they are putting something on stage that is ridiculous and not to be taken seriously. So, yes, it is not just that this music is old and of the past and therefore has different perceptions. No, I think that the creators know precisely what they are doing. And so we are watching this opera and we see a totally absurd scenario play out. But so frequently, we find ourselves sucked in by Mozart's wonderful music, drawn in by the words the characters are saying that seem incredibly genuine, incredibly truthful, and incredibly emotive, despite the fact that the scenario that has brought them about is absolutely ridiculous. You will find yourself, I think, as listeners and viewers of this opera, surprised at how drawn in you are able to be by a plot that on the surface seems like some kind of ridiculous construction. It sucks you in ways that you don't anticipate. And it is Mozart's miraculous music that accomplishes this for us. So with the stretch of time that we've got left, I'd like to examine sort of four key moments in this opera that will give us some sense of how this music plays a part. Così fan tutte, with an E at the end. I may mispronounce it. Italian is not a language I am good at. The singers fault me for that frequently. So let's look at the very beginning of the opera to start. If you are listening on good speakers or on headphones, you should hear pretty high quality sound, but adjust your volume as needed. I'll be sharing the audio here. You should hear it. I want to start with the way that this opera opens. It is, of course, common for an opera to begin with an overture. That is completely to be expected. What is perhaps unexpected, though, is the way in which this number plays upon genre expectations. The ways in which we don't quite know what kind of opera this is going to be at the outset. As is typical of overture form, Mozart writes an overture that is essentially equivalent to the opening movement of a symphony. It has a slow introduction, followed by a fast section in sonata form, which is what a symphony would have. And Mozart starts this overture, if you know nothing about the opera, nothing about the plot, he starts it in a way that seems very, very serious, as if this is a work to be taken entirely in earnest. Sounds like this. Pause it before we go to the fast section. This could start any serious opera of the time. Big, bold chords from the orchestra, contrasted with subtle solo lines for the woodwind principals. A listener going to the opera house, hearing that, would think that they are prepared for a very serious night at the theater until the fast section begins. Let's back it up just a few seconds. And I'll pause it right there. At this point, we have been thrown into a completely different dramatical world. This is the sound world of comic opera. This is the sound world of farce, of comedy, not of the seriousness with which we began. And so right from the outset, Mozart is trying to prepare us, I think, for the fact that this is an opera based on two dissimilar things constantly confronting each other. The sincerity of emotions brought about by absolutely ridiculous plot scenario. So one other interesting thing arises in this overture, and we heard it in the slow introduction. We heard the big orchestral hits, the woodwind solo, the big orchestral hits, the woodwind solo, and then a cadential passage that at the outset of the overture doesn't mean anything to the listeners. But strikingly, it makes its appearance near the end of the opera. The last number, which is essentially a solo for Don Alfonso, the last number right before the finale at the very end of the opera, reprises that same musical material. And so we need to listen to this passage now. In the score, Mozart gives it number 30. Sounds like this. Again, Don Alfonso, the one who set the bet, the one who set this absurd plot in motion at the beginning, is the one who sings this material.
ed io le scuso se 1000 volte al di cangiano amore altri un vizio lo chiama ed altri un uso da me por necessità del core l'amante che si trova al fin deluso non condanni la cui al proprio errore già che giovani vecchie e belle e brutte ripetete con me
right here.
Così fan tutte così fan tutte.
So it turns out that that brief cadential fragment at the end of the slow introduction of the overture is, in fact, the statement that Mozart is reserving for almost the very end of the opera, where the title of the opera itself is given, and where the quote-unquote moral of the story is presented by the characters, that they're all like that. Now, the commentary that was going on in the chat about tutte versus tutti, masculine or feminine. And so we've got the feminine, tutti. The women are all like that, meaning every woman is going to be fickle. Every woman is going to be proven to lack fidelity. Every woman is going to change her affections if given the chance to do it. But I think that Mozart and Da Ponte are working a subtler telling of this than this gender-specific reading that we hear from Don Alfonso. Remember, the character of Don Alfonso is the one setting this plot into motion from the beginning. He's the one who convinces the men to go along with this wager. He's the one who convinces them to pretend to go off to war, to come back in disguise, to woo their counterpart's woman, etc. So we know he is not to be trusted. To take him as our moral authority is probably a terrible idea. And what in fact we see is that yes, the women did change their affection. Yes, they did prove untrue despite their previous promises. But the men are just as culpable. The men are eager to play this game, enjoying themselves in many instances at the fact that they're trying to seduce their friend's fiancé. And so I think that they're all that way. Yes, it is feminine in this instance because that is what the grammar requires. But I think if we take a step back, if we seek out that ambiguity, we see that this is just as condemnatory about the ways that the men are behaving as it is about what the women have done. So that little fragment in the overture has no meaning then, picks up all this meaning by the end of the opera, and the trick that Mozart is trying to play musically is established right there at the beginning, even if it doesn't make sense until the very end of this opera. So that's what we find with the overture. Let's look at some other issues of musical style with the time we've got left, and I'd like to look at two of the ensembles from near the beginning in the first act. First, from one of the trios, a trio sung by the three male characters. And this is the moment in which Ferrando and Guglielmo have been convinced that they want to play along with this trick, and so they are very pleased and excited to pretend like they're going off to war. Consequently, Mozart writes for them what his audience would have perceived as the kind of music that they are used to hearing in an opera when serious, heroic characters do serious, heroic things. It sounds like this. Let's see, what do I have to do? I've got to fast forward 18 seconds. So let me get it cued to the right place here. Pause it right there. Notice what we are hearing in the orchestra. Blazing trumpet fanfares, timpani supporting the rhythmic activity of the whole thing. These are the sound markers of heroic characters in serious opera doing heroic things in serious plots. So Mozart's audience would have recognized that without thinking. We can presume that they regularly go to the opera, that they have seen lots of works in the repertory. They know how serious operas behave. They know how comedic operas behave. And so it is natural for Mozart to use this military-style music, since Ferrando and Guglielmo are pretending to go off to war. But of course, we, the audience, know they're not. We know the whole thing is a sham, the whole thing is a fraud to exit themselves from the scene so that they can come back in disguise, all to the tune of really serious, earnest music, which is immediately negated by the music that happens when Alfonso starts to sing.
Sar'anch'io de convitati. Ci sarete, sì, signore, ci sarete, sì, signore, ci sarete, sì, signore. E che brindis predicati, far vogliamo il Dio d'amore.
Did you notice how the color of the orchestra was entirely different? For that stretch, the trumpets were gone, the timpani were gone, and instead we hear this bassoon in the bass sort of chortling along with this fast motion stuff. That is the sound world of comic opera. Mozart has pulled the same trick on us that he did in his overture, starting off with music that seems purely serious, but then changing in an instant to music that comes out of the sound world of comic opera. So keeping us off balance, juxtaposing those two contradictory things. One final audio example then. Number 8 in the opera is a chorus in which the chorus of soldiers say, "Come on, join the troop, we're going off to war." This segues into what then the modern edition of the score calls number 8A, a quintet. This is a farewell quintet. This is the moment in which the two women bid farewell to their two fiancés. And we know, we the audience know, that this is a completely fraudulent scenario, that it is contrived, that it is brought about for the purpose of working this scenario that Don Alfonso has dreamt up. The music that Mozart writes for it, though, is incredibly profound, is as sincere and genuine as anything that the man ever wrote in any opera that he ever wrote. And so this is sort of the last trick that Mozart works with. We've seen the juxtaposition trick. Well, this is a different one. This is to write music of great emotional sincerity, drawing us into the plot, convincing us to care about these characters, convincing us to believe in their emotional struggles. And as soon as we find ourselves totally there sympathizing with the characters on stage, we remember, but the whole thing's a joke. The whole thing is a fraud. The whole thing is a lie being perpetrated to try to trick these women. And so we are sort of thrust into what I think is intended to be sort of an uncomfortable place for an audience to be in. Again, we want to naturally believe that these are honest expressions. And so we find ourselves really feeling emotionally moved by this, only to remember what it is that brought about this circumstance in the first place. So let's look to conclude at a few minutes from this marvelous, marvelous quintet. I'll let us finish it because it's worth listening to. But did you notice the trick that Mozart pulled? When he starts, they're singing these little short fragments, separated by rest, just a syllable at a time. It makes us question, do they really feel this? Or are they just putting on the act that they know they're supposed to seem this sad when their fiance is about to leave, which is why they have this sort of one-upsmanship, make sure you write to me every day. No, make sure you write to me twice a day, because they're trying to show, just how much they really care. And so that part seems like maybe everybody's in on the joke until here, when they say farewell. Their lines become longer. The note values are connected. We get these soaring lyrical melodies. And now it seems like maybe they really are feeling this. And we, the audience, have been duped, which is precisely what Mozart is trying to do, to sucker us in with this absurd scenario into realizing the profundity of what these feelings are really all about. It's as beautiful music of parting as could possibly be composed. We are certainly convinced by it. Only Don Alfonso seems to be immune to the depth of profundity that Mozart has laid out here. So with that, I hope that you have some strategies now for making sense of this work, for understanding what it is that Mozart is trying to accomplish in this work. And I hope that you will, one, join me next week for some additional listening to Così fan tutte together, and of course, have a wonderful night at the opera when you go see it at the end of this month. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank y'all so much for being here. Have a great night. Thank you so much, Aaron. This was so wonderful.
Great pleasure. Good to have such a big crowd, too. Lovely to see everybody.